silence is a gift most people never truly receive. I learned this in March of 1986, when a blizzard swept me from the pilgrim trail between Tengbosch and Pangbosch and deposited me into a world most humans never witness. My name is Tenzin Norbu, and I am the monk who disappeared for 9 days into the high places and returned with knowledge that has shaped every moment of the 38 years since. I was 24 years old that spring, a junior monk at Tengbosch Monastery, tasked with delivering sacred texts to our sister monastery in Pangbosch. The journey normally took 6 hours along well-traveled paths, a routine trip I had made dozens of times. But March weather in the Khumbu region is treacherous, shifting from clear skies to whiteout conditions with minimal warning. The storm hit without precedent. Winds that knocked me from my feet, snow so thick I couldn't see my hand before my face, cold that penetrated every layer of clothing within minutes. I lost the trail immediately, disoriented by the complete absence of visibility, stumbling through drifts that rose past my knees and sapped my strength with terrifying efficiency. I should have found shelter, should have dug into a snow bank and waited out the worst of the storm. But panic overrode training. My mind convinced that continuing forward would eventually lead me to Pangbosch despite having no sense of direction. I walked for what felt like hours, my body growing increasingly numb, my consciousness beginning to drift into the dissociation that precedes death by exposure. I remember falling, my legs finally giving out, my body collapsing into snow that felt almost warm compared to the air tearing at my exposed skin. I remember thinking this was a foolish way to die, that my teachers would be disappointed I had panicked rather than calmly accepting circumstances and making wise choices. And I remember a presence, massive and dark against the white chaos, lifting me as if I weighed nothing. When I regained full consciousness, I was in a cave, wrapped in furs that smelled animal and ancient, lying near a fire that should have been impossible at the altitude where I found myself. My body ached with the deep cold that follows severe exposure, but I was alive, sheltered, and no longer alone. The being that had saved me sat across the fire, watching me with eyes that reflected the flames with an amber glow. It was perhaps 9 feet tall, covered in thick white fur, with a face that combined ape and human features in proportions that created something entirely unique. I should have been terrified, but my monastic training recognized consciousness in those eyes, intelligence that demanded respect rather than fear. Yeti, I whispered in Tibetan, using the common name for beings my teachers had always insisted were metaphorical rather than literal. You're real. The creature tilted its head, and I felt meaning pass between us without words, acknowledgement, perhaps, or simple confirmation that reality contained more than most humans acknowledged. I tried to sit up, but my body protested, muscles refusing to cooperate after their ordeal. The creature made a sound, low and rumbling, that somehow conveyed instruction to remain still and rest. It produced a bowl, carved wood, simple but clearly crafted with skill, and filled it with liquid from a container I hadn't noticed. The bowl was offered to me, the gesture unmistakably an offer of hospitality. I accepted with shaking hands, drinking what tasted like herbal tea, bitter but warming in ways that transcended simple temperature. Within minutes, feeling was returning to my extremities, the deep cold receding, replaced by exhaustion that felt more natural than the dissociation that had preceded my collapse. "Thank you," I said, not knowing if it could understand Tibetan or any human language, but feeling the need to express gratitude. "You saved my life." The creature's response came not in words, but in a sensation of meaning that seemed to bypass language entirely. It had not saved me randomly, but deliberately, recognizing something in me that made rescue worthwhile. I was being evaluated even as I was being cared for, judged to determine whether I could receive what it needed to communicate. Tenzin has been saved by a being that shouldn't exist, but this is only the beginning of 9 days that will change his understanding of everything. If you're intrigued, make sure to like this video and subscribe for the incredible revelation to come. The cave was larger than I initially realized, extending back into the mountain in passages that suggested long occupation. As my strength returned and my eyes adjusted to the flickering firelight, I saw evidence of deliberate habitation, stored food wrapped in what appeared to be treated hides, implements carved from wood and stone, and most surprisingly, symbols marked on the cave walls that suggested language or record-keeping. The creature watched my exploration with patient attention, allowing my curiosity without interfering. When I approached the wall markings, studying the symbols that looked vaguely like Tibetan script but weren't quite, it made a sound that drew my attention. Then it began gesturing, a complex sequence of movements that clearly carried meaning even though I couldn't immediately interpret them. Slowly, through repetition and my own growing receptivity to the nonverbal communication it was using, I began to understand. The symbols were records, histories, documentation of events spanning what might be centuries or millennia. The creature's species had been present in these mountains longer than human civilization had existed in the valleys below. They had watched our development, our expansion, our slow encroachment into territories that had once been exclusively theirs. The creature gestured at a particular sequence of symbols, and I felt knowledge transfer, images flooding my consciousness, showing me the Himalaya as it had been hundreds of years ago. Glaciers extending far lower than their current positions, forests at altitudes where only rock exists now, and most significantly, a visible population of the creatures, perhaps hundreds of them, living across the entire mountain range. Then the images shifted, showing change over time. The glaciers retreating, the forests dying, the creatures' numbers declining as their habitat was destroyed and fragmented. And intercut with these environmental changes were images of humans, not the nomadic populations that had existed in sustainable balance for millennia, but modern humans with their roads and buildings and industry, their climbing expeditions and resource extraction and relentless expansion. The creature was showing me ecological collapse, the systematic destruction of the Himalayan environment, documented across generations by beings whose lifespans allowed them to witness changes humans experienced as gradual and therefore ignorable. What we perceived as minor shifts across decades, they experienced as catastrophic transformation across lifetimes. I felt overwhelming sadness as I processed what I was being shown. My monastery's teachings emphasized harmony with nature, respect for all sentient beings, understanding that human existence was interwoven with the health of our environment. But the reality I was witnessing suggested we had failed, that our actions were destroying ecosystems and driving species to extinction even as we performed rituals requesting protection for all living things. What can I do? I asked aloud, my voice breaking with emotion. I'm just a junior monk. I have no power to stop what's happening. The creature's response came as a sensation of purpose rather than words. It had saved me not randomly, but because I represented something. Connection to traditions that valued preservation. Membership in a community that might listen and act where others would not. Potential to become witness and advocate for truth that needed to be told. But first, I needed to understand more deeply. The surface knowledge I'd received was insufficient. If I was to carry this message forward, I needed to experience the full scope of what was being lost, to witness with all my senses rather than simply being told. The creature gestured toward the back of the cave, toward passages I had not yet explored, and I understood the invitation. My 9 days of disappearance were only beginning, and what I would witness in the depths would transform me from monk seeking enlightenment into guardian trying to preserve it. The creature led me deeper into the mountain, through passages that showed signs of long use and deliberate modification. We descended for what felt like hours, moving through chambers heated by geothermal activity that made the deeper caves surprisingly comfortable despite the altitude and external cold. And in those depths, I found community. Not just the single creature that had saved me, but 5 others, ranging from what appeared to be elderly individuals moving with careful deliberation to juveniles that watched my passage with curiosity that seemed distinctly childlike. This wasn't a lone survivor, but a family group, maintaining traditions and caring for each other in ways that paralleled human social structures. They communicated with each other through vocalizations I couldn't interpret and gestures whose meanings I could only partly grasp. But the emotional content was clear: concern for my presence, debate about whether revealing themselves to me was wise, eventual acceptance that their elder had made a decision that would be honored even if not all agreed with it. The elder, my rescuer, brought me to a particular chamber that took my breath away. The walls were covered not just with symbols, but with art, depictions of the creature's history rendered in natural pigments with skill that suggested aesthetic sophistication beyond simple record-keeping. Some images were clearly ancient, faded and weathered, while others looked recent, still bright and detailed. The elder gestured at the oldest images, and I felt knowledge transfer about their origins. The creatures had lived across the entire Himalayan range, perhaps thousands of them, occupying territories from Bhutan to Kashmir, existing in balance with environment and with the human populations that shared the lower altitudes. They were guardians in the true sense, not owners of territory but caretakers of it, maintaining health of ecosystems that supported all life in the region. Then the images shifted to more recent times, showing human expansion accelerating, forests cut down, rivers dammed, minerals extracted, and showing the creature's response: retreat into higher altitudes, abandonment of traditional territories, population decline as habitat fragmentation made sustainable breeding populations impossible. Tenzin is witnessing the hidden cost of human progress, documented by beings who have watched for centuries. The truth about the Himalayas' destruction is being revealed. Hit like and subscribe to see what he does with this knowledge. The most recent images were devastating. They showed specific locations I recognized. Areas near Namche Bazaar where new hotels were being constructed, regions around Lukla where the airstrip had expanded, valleys where trekking routes had transformed pristine wilderness into garbage-strewn trails. And they showed the consequences: creatures driven from traditional territories, young ones dying because critical food sources no longer existed, elders choosing death over relocation because the trauma of displacement was too great. "We're killing you," I said, the realization crushing in its weight. Not intentionally, not even knowingly, but through our expansion and our waste and our assumption that the mountains exist for our use without cost to other inhabitants. The elder touched my shoulder, and I felt something more complex than simple agreement. It wasn't that humans were deliberately malicious, but that we were catastrophically ignorant, treating the mountains as empty wilderness when they were in fact inhabited ecosystems, assuming our actions had no consequences because we couldn't see the beings we were affecting. But there was more to show me, something that made the environmental destruction personal in ways mere observation couldn't achieve. The elder gestured for me to follow one of the younger creatures, a female who moved with grace that suggested she was comfortable with my presence. She led me to a smaller chamber, one that had clearly been used as a nursery. And there, arranged with obvious care and reverence, I saw bones. Small bones, juvenile remains, 3 sets of them laid out as memorials. The female made sounds that needed no translation. These had been her children, dead not from violence or disease, but from starvation when the foods they depended on had disappeared from their traditional ranges. I wept, falling to my knees before those small bones, overwhelmed by grief and shame. These deaths had occurred in the last decade, perhaps even the last few years, while I had been at Tengbosch Monastery studying texts and performing rituals, completely unaware that sentient beings were dying because of my species' actions. The female touched my head gently, and I felt her attempt at comfort even through her own grief. She wasn't blaming me personally, but was trusting me with her loss, hoping I would carry it forward, that her children's deaths would mean something if they could motivate humans to change course before more losses became inevitable. I spent 3 days in those caves, learning and witnessing, my understanding of the Himalayas' ecological crisis deepening with each passing hour. The creatures showed me everything: their social structures, their knowledge of medicinal plants, their sophisticated understanding of weather patterns and glacial cycles, their cultural practices that included art, ritual, and what appeared to be spiritual beliefs about the mountains they inhabited. But they also showed me the scope of destruction. Through careful documentation spanning generations, they had tracked glacier retreat, forest death, species extinction, and pollution that was reaching even the most remote valleys. What scientists were beginning to measure in abstract data, these beings had experienced as lived reality, watching their worlds systematically dismantled by forces they could not control. On the 4th day, the elder took me to a location that required climbing to significant altitude, approaching 19,000 feet. The exertion was tremendous, my body still recovering from the exposure that had nearly killed me. But the elder moved with patience, adjusting pace to my limitations, occasionally offering herbal preparations that improved my altitude tolerance in ways I couldn't explain. We reached a promontory that provided views across the entire Khumbu region, from the peaks of Everest and Lhotse down to the valleys where human settlements clustered. The elder gestured at the landscape, and I saw what it wanted me to see. Not the majesty of mountains, but the signs of degradation visible even at this distance. Brown patches where forests should have been green, irregular snow patterns suggesting pollution deposits, and trails carved into previously pristine slopes by thousands of trekking boots. The elder produced something from the natural pouch formed by its thick fur, a small object that it placed in my hands with obvious reverence. It was a seed, perhaps from a plant species I didn't recognize, carefully preserved and clearly precious. Through the communication we had developed, the elder conveyed its meaning. This was from a plant that had once grown throughout their territories, providing critical nutrition especially for juveniles. The plant was extinct now, eliminated by temperature changes and habitat destruction, one of dozens of species that had vanished within the elder's lifetime. The elder was giving me this seed not as gift, but as evidence, as proof of what was being lost, as motivation to carry this knowledge back to human communities that might still be able to prevent further collapse. I accepted it with trembling hands, understanding the trust being placed in me, the hope that I would be worthy of it. On the 5th day, I asked the question that had been building since my arrival. Why me? I'm nobody important. I have no influence, no resources, no power to change the forces destroying your home. Why reveal all this to a junior monk who might not even be believed? The elder's response came through the clearest transmission yet, as if our days together had developed my capacity to receive its communication. I had been chosen not despite my lack of conventional power, but because of it. Monks held different kind of influence, moral authority, cultural respect, access to networks of spiritual communities across the region. A politician or scientist making these claims would be dismissed as having agenda. But a monk speaking from spiritual conviction and direct witness might be heard differently. Moreover, I represented a tradition that theoretically valued all sentient beings, that taught interconnection between human well-being and environmental health, that should understand the consequences of disrupting sacred balance. If my monastery and the broader Buddhist community could not be moved to action by this knowledge, then perhaps no human community could be, and the creatures would face extinction knowing they had attempted every possible avenue of communication. The weight of this reasoning was crushing. I was being asked to return to my monastery and essentially tell them that our philosophy was being tested, that our claims about compassion and interconnection were being measured against our willingness to change behaviors that were killing beings whose existence most of us denied. On the sixth day, the storm that had swept me from the trail finally cleared, revealing perfect weather that would allow safe return to human territories. The elder began preparing me for departure, providing food for the journey, and adjusting my clothing to maximize warmth. But first, there was one final lesson. The elder led me to the chamber with the historical images and gestured at the most recent editions, images that were still being created, depicting events from the past few months. These showed an increase in climbing activity on Everest, new building construction in Namche, and most disturbingly, evidence of illegal hunting in protected areas. The creatures were documenting ongoing destruction in real time, maintaining records that would outlast them but might never be seen by humans who could act on the information. But there was something else in these recent images, depictions of myself, being carried from the storm, being cared for in the cave, witnessing the history on the walls. The creatures were documenting our encounter, recording it as a significant event in their history, even if they couldn't know whether it would ultimately matter. The elder touched the image of me, then touched my chest over my heart, and I felt the weight of expectation settle fully. I was being released not just to return home, but to become advocate, to speak for beings who had chosen to break their pattern of isolation because they had no other options remaining. My disappearance and reappearance would be significant events in human community as well. Questions would be asked about where I had been, what I had experienced, whether the stories I told could be trusted. Tenzin is about to return to a world that won't believe what he's witnessed. The truth about the Himalaya's destruction and its hidden inhabitants must be told, but who will listen? Make sure you're subscribed and hit like to see what happens when ancient wisdom meets modern skepticism. The elder gave me 3 things before I departed. The first was the seed I'd already received, evidence of extinction. The second was a small carved figure, similar to those I'd seen in the historical chamber, depicting one of their species with remarkable detail. It was art and artifact, proof of cultural sophistication. And the third was a piece of fur, clearly from one of the creatures, that would allow for genetic analysis if anyone ever took my claims seriously enough to test it scientifically. I'll tell them, I promised, my voice thick with emotion. I'll find ways to make them listen, to make them understand what's being lost. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I promise I'll try. The elder placed both massive hands on my shoulders, looking directly into my eyes, and I felt its full attention, its hope and its doubt, its desperate need for me to succeed balanced against its experience that humans rarely changed course even when consequences were clear. Then it released me and gestured toward the cave entrance, toward the brilliant sunshine beyond, toward the human world I would have to navigate with knowledge that would make me alien even to those who knew me best. The journey back to the trail took most of the day, the elder guiding me through terrain I would never have managed alone, delivering me to a location perhaps 2 miles from where I had been swept away. Before it departed, it made one final sound, complex and layered, that somehow conveyed farewell and hope and warning all simultaneously. Then it was gone, disappearing into the landscape with speed that made tracking impossible, leaving me alone with evidence I couldn't lose and knowledge I couldn't unlearn. I reached Tengbosch Monastery as evening fell on the 9th day of my disappearance. The monks erupted in celebration and relief when I appeared, having assumed I was dead, already planning memorial services. They surrounded me with questions. Where had I been? How had I survived? What had happened during the 9 days I'd been missing? I told them I needed rest, that I would explain everything once I had recovered. But as I lay in my cell that night, my body exhausted but my mind racing, I knew that explaining would be the hardest thing I'd ever attempted. I had evidence, but evidence could be dismissed. I had experience, but experience could be attributed to exposure-induced delusion. I had knowledge that needed to be acted upon, but knowledge without credibility was just noise in a world already overwhelmed with competing claims for attention. The creatures had saved my life and trusted me with their truth. Now I had to find a way to honor that trust while operating in human systems that were fundamentally resistant to truths that required significant change. The monastery's response to my return was complex. Joy at my survival warred with concern about my mental state, skepticism about my story mixed with cultural respect for religious experience that might transcend ordinary reality. The abbot, Lama Sonam, listened to my account with the careful attention he brought to all matters requiring judgment. I told him everything: the blizzard, the rescue, the 9 days in the caves, the beings who had saved me and shown me their documented history of the Himalayas' ecological collapse. I showed him the evidence, the carved figure, the first sample, and most significantly, the seed from an extinct plant species. I spoke of the juvenile bones, the memorial chamber, the female's grief that had broken my heart. Lama Sonam was silent for a long time after I finished. Finally, he said, "The Yeti have been part of our cultural knowledge for centuries, but most treat them as symbolic rather than literal, representations of the wild, untamed nature of high places. You are claiming they are real, intelligent, and trying to communicate ecological crisis through you." "Yes, Lama, that is exactly what I'm claiming. And you understand how this will be received by most people? The scientific community will dismiss it as delusion or fraud. The government will resist anything that impedes development and tourism. Even other monasteries may question whether exposure and trauma have affected your judgment. I understand, Lama, but I also understand that I was chosen precisely because I'm a monk, because our tradition teaches that all sentient beings deserve compassion, because we claim to value truth over convenience. If we cannot respond to this, if we cannot act on knowledge gained through direct witness, then our teachings are hollow." Lama Sonam examined the evidence I'd brought, particularly interested in the carved figure. Its craftsmanship was undeniable, too sophisticated to dismiss as random object, too detailed to be simple folk art. The first sample was equally compelling, thick and coarse in ways that didn't match known Himalayan species. "I believe you encountered something," he said carefully. "Whether it was exactly what you describe or something filtered through extreme experience, I cannot say with certainty. But I believe you witnessed something that profoundly affected you, and I believe you are sincere in your conviction that action is necessary." It was less than full endorsement, but more than dismissal. Lama Sonam agreed to convene a meeting of the monastery's senior monks to discuss my experience and consider appropriate response. He also connected me with contacts in the conservation community, people who might be more receptive to ecological warnings than to claims about undiscovered species. Over the following weeks, I told my story repeatedly, to monks who ranged from believing to deeply skeptical, to Western researchers working on Himalayan conservation projects who saw the environmental concerns as valid even if they doubted the source, to journalists who were drawn by the sensational aspects but occasionally grasped the underlying message about ecological crisis. The responses fell into predictable patterns. Those already concerned about environmental degradation found my testimony compelling regardless of whether they believed in the creatures. The documented changes I described matched scientific observations about glacier retreat, biodiversity loss, and pollution increase. Those invested in continued development dismissed both the beings and the environmental warnings as obstacles to progress that benefited local populations. In June 1986, 3 months after my return, I received an unexpected visitor at the monastery. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an American ecologist working with the World Wildlife Fund, had heard about my experience through conservation networks and wanted to discuss it in detail. Unlike many of the researchers I'd spoken with, she didn't immediately dismiss the possibility of undiscovered primate species. The Himalaya is vast and largely unexplored, she explained as we walked the monastery grounds. We're still discovering new species regularly: plants, insects, small mammals. A large primate would be harder to miss, but not impossible if the population is small and deliberately avoiding human contact. What interests me most isn't whether your Yeti exists in the form you describe, but whether the environmental documentation you witnessed is accurate. I showed her my sketches, crude reproductions of the images I'd seen on the cave walls, depicting glacial positions at different time periods, forest boundaries, and species distributions. Sarah studied them intently, comparing them to her own data on environmental change in the region. "These are consistent with what we're seeing," she said, her voice excited. "If anything, they suggest the rate of change is accelerating faster than our models predict. The glacier retreat patterns, the forest dieback at specific altitudes, your sketches show this happening over decades, which matches our field observations but contradicts the more optimistic projections some agencies are using." "Can you use this?" I asked. "Can the information help, even without confirming the source?" "Possibly. If I present it as indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological documentation maintained by local communities, it might carry weight with agencies that discount Western environmental science as biased. The irony is that your mysterious benefactors may have inadvertently provided exactly the kind of evidence that conservation efforts need: long-term observation documented across multiple generations." Tenzin's testimony is finding unexpected allies, and the truth about the Himalayas crisis is beginning to spread. But will knowledge lead to action, or just more debate? Stay with us. Like and subscribe to witness whether truth can overcome inertia. Sarah and I developed a partnership over the following months. She had scientific credibility and institutional connections that I lacked. I had direct witness and cultural authority that gave environmental concerns moral weight beyond simple data. Together, we began advocating for expanded protected areas, reduced trekking traffic in sensitive regions, and stricter enforcement of existing environmental regulations. But we also faced organized opposition. The tourism industry, which generated significant revenue for Nepal's economy, resisted any restrictions on access. Government officials worried that environmental regulations would limit development opportunities. And some conservation organizations were skeptical of claims that seemed to prioritize hypothetical species over the needs of human populations living in poverty. The creatures themselves I never saw again. though I returned multiple times to the region where I'd been rescued, hoping for another encounter. The cave I'd sheltered in was either hidden too well for me to relocate or had been deliberately concealed. Sometimes I wondered if the entire experience had been exposure-induced hallucination, as skeptics suggested, if my conviction was based on trauma rather than reality. But then I would hold the carved figure, examine the first sample that multiple labs had tested and found anomalous, plant the seed in carefully controlled conditions, and watch it grow into a plant species botanists couldn't identify. The evidence was real, even if I couldn't replicate the encounter that produced it. By 1990, 4 years after my disappearance, the environmental movement in Nepal had gained momentum, though not always for reasons related to my testimony. International concern about climate change was increasing, with the Himalaya recognized as a particularly vulnerable region. The tourism industry itself was beginning to acknowledge that unregulated growth was degrading the very landscapes that attracted visitors. I had become something of a spokesman for conservation, invited to conferences and meetings, my story of surviving 9 days in the wilderness and emerging with environmental message resonating with audiences even when the details about my rescuers were downplayed or omitted entirely. I learned to adapt my message to different audiences, emphasizing spiritual responsibility to Buddhist groups, highlighting ecological data with scientists, focusing on economic sustainability with government officials. But I also faced criticism from unexpected quarters. Some fellow monks accused me of using religion to advance environmental agenda, suggesting my testimony was fabrication designed to pressure people towards specific political positions. Younger activists thought I was too cautious, too willing to compromise with industries that should be completely excluded from sensitive areas. And some conservation scientists viewed me as well-meaning but naive, someone whose religious background made me too emotional about issues that required cold calculation of costs and benefits. The creatures remained absent, or at least invisible. Occasionally I would hear reports of unusual sightings in remote areas, footprints that didn't match known species, sounds in the night that suggested large animals where none should exist. I investigated when possible, but found nothing conclusive. Either the beings were more careful now, or their numbers had declined to the point where encounters became vanishingly rare. In 1995, 9 years after my experience, I made a pilgrimage to the high valleys where I'd been saved. I was 33 years old, no longer a junior monk, but not yet a senior teacher, occupying middle space where experience competed with continuing questions. I traveled alone, carrying offerings and prayers, hoping to find some sign that the beings still existed and that my years of advocacy had made any difference to their survival. I found the cave. After days of searching, following half memories and intuition, I located the entrance I'd been carried through 9 years earlier. It was empty. No fire pit, no stored supplies, no evidence of recent habitation. The chambers that had held community were abandoned, the walls with their documented history weathered but still faintly visible. I sat in that empty cave for an entire day, meditating and mourning, unsure whether the beings had relocated or simply vanished, whether my advocacy had been too little and too late, whether the environmental collapse they documented was already irreversible. The silence in that cave was complete, oppressive, the absence of presence more powerful than presence itself would have been. But as I prepared to leave at dusk, I found something that had been deliberately placed where I would see it. A small carving, recently made, depicting me sitting in meditation. Someone had been here, had seen me, had left this message. The beings weren't extinct. They were simply more hidden, more cautious, perhaps less hopeful that human contact could lead to anything but further risk. I carried that carving back to Tengbosch with renewed determination. They were still out there, still surviving, still watching to see if humans would demonstrate wisdom sufficient to preserve the spaces we shared. My advocacy couldn't stop, couldn't diminish in the face of opposition or slow progress. As long as they persisted, I had to persist. The early 2000s brought both progress and setbacks. The Sagarmatha National Park expanded its protected areas, with some of the new boundaries corresponding to regions I'd identified as critical habitat. Regulations on trekking groups became stricter, with waste management requirements and penalties for environmental violations. The international community increased funding for Himalayan conservation, recognizing the region's importance for global climate and biodiversity. But climate change was accelerating faster than mitigation efforts, with visible impacts that exceeded even the dire documentation the creatures had shown me. Glaciers retreated at rates that shocked scientists. Species distributions shifted as temperature zones moved higher, leaving some animals with nowhere to go. And the pollution that reached even the most remote valleys increased, carried by atmospheric patterns from industrial regions hundreds of miles away. I was 52 years old in 2014, a senior teacher at Tengbosch, when I received a letter from Sarah Mitchell. She was retiring from active fieldwork, but wanted to meet one final time to discuss the 30 years since our first collaboration. We met in Kathmandu, two people aged by decades of work that had achieved some victories, but fallen short of the transformative change we'd hoped for. Do you still believe in them? Sarah asked as we shared tea in a quiet cafe. The beings that saved you? After all these years without another confirmed sighting, do you still maintain they're real? Yes, I said without hesitation. The evidence hasn't disappeared. My experience hasn't become less vivid. And the environmental changes they documented continue to accelerate exactly as they predicted. Whether they still exist in the same form, I can't say. But they were real, and their message was true. Sarah pulled out a folder, opening it to reveal photographs and data I hadn't seen before. These are from the past 5 years, she explained. Anomalous findings we've been quietly documenting. Unusual footprints found by field researchers in extremely remote areas. Shelter structures that show signs of deliberate construction by unknown agents. And this, she indicated a particular image, thermal signature captured by satellite that shows heat patterns in locations where no known animals should be generating that kind of output. The beings may still be out there, adapting and surviving in the shadows. But time is running out for both them and the habitat they've protected for millennia. Make sure you're subscribed and hit like to see how Tenzin's lifelong mission concludes. You've been tracking them? I asked, surprised and concerned. Not tracking for exploitation, Sarah corrected quickly. Monitoring to ensure they're not being inadvertently harmed by conservation work. If they exist, they're part of the ecosystem we're trying to protect. We need to account for their needs, even if we can't publicly acknowledge their presence. It was validation I hadn't expected, scientific recognition, however quiet, that the beings merited consideration in conservation planning. Sarah had spent 3 decades working within systems that demanded conventional evidence, but she'd never completely dismissed the possibility that my testimony pointed to something real and important. What happens now? I asked. The environmental crisis continues to worsen. The beings, if they survive, are being squeezed into smaller and smaller refuges. Have we made any real difference? Yes and no, Sarah replied honestly. We've preserved some critical areas, raised awareness, slowed some of the worst practices. But we're still losing ground to forces larger than any regional effort can counter. Global climate change, economic pressures, human population growth. The question isn't whether we've solved the crisis, but whether we've bought enough time for adaptation. whether we've preserved enough diversity that recovery remains possible when circumstances finally shift. It was a sobering assessment, but not a hopeless one. We had done what we could with the resources and understanding available. The creatures had trusted me with their knowledge, hoping it would catalyze change sufficient to preserve their world. That change had been partial, incomplete, but not entirely absent. I am 62 years old now, writing this in 2024, 38 years after a blizzard swept me from a mountain trail and deposited me into knowledge that shaped my entire adult life. I am no longer at Tengbosch. I lead a small hermitage now, higher in the mountains, closer to the places where the beings once lived and might still survive in diminished numbers. The environmental crisis the creatures showed me in 1986 has fully materialized. The glaciers are dramatically smaller than they were then. The forests are struggling at boundaries that have shifted higher, and species that were abundant are now rare or extinct. The documentation they maintained proved accurate in every significant detail. They understood what was coming because they'd been witnessing the process unfold across lifetimes measured in centuries rather than decades. But there has been progress too. Consciousness about environmental issues has grown substantially. Young people throughout the Himalaya are engaged with conservation in ways that seemed impossible in the 1980s. International cooperation on climate issues, while insufficient, is more robust than it was. The protected areas have expanded, the regulations have strengthened, and perhaps most importantly, the cultural narrative has shifted. Mountains are increasingly understood as living systems requiring care rather than resources awaiting exploitation. I never had another direct encounter with the creatures. The cave I found empty in 1995 remains empty when I visit it now. The sounds in the night that suggested large animals in unexpected places have grown quieter and less frequent. The thermal anomalies that Sarah detected have diminished in recent years. Whether this means the beings have died out, relocated beyond detection, or transformed into forms we cannot easily observe, I cannot say with certainty. But I carry their legacy forward. The evidence they entrusted to me, the carved figures, the first sample, the seed that grew into a plant now cultivated in protected gardens. These remain as proof that consciousness more varied than we typically acknowledge has existed in these mountains. The knowledge they shared about environmental collapse has been borne out by events, validating their understanding even if the source remains disputed. I have trained younger monks in environmental stewardship, passing forward not just my experience, but the underlying philosophy that all beings deserve consideration, that human activity must account for its impacts on all life, that preservation of sacred spaces serves practical as well as spiritual purposes. Some of them believe my story about the 9 days with the beings. Others view it as useful metaphor or teaching story, valuable for its message regardless of literal truth. Both responses serve the purpose, inspiring action to protect mountain ecosystems that sustain all who depend on them. The carved figure the elder gave me in 1986 sits in my hermitage, a daily reminder of trust placed in me and responsibilities that continue. I hold it during meditation, remembering massive hands that lifted me from snow that should have been my grave, amber eyes that held intelligence demanding recognition, and communication that transcended language to convey urgency about destruction most humans still struggle to acknowledge. The beings saved my life when they could have simply let nature take its course. They revealed their existence when centuries of experience suggested that hiding was safer than contact. They documented environmental collapse spanning generations and chose to share that knowledge with a junior monk who had no obvious power to affect change. All of this represented faith in human potential to grow beyond our destructive patterns, to recognize our interconnection with all life. to choose preservation over exploitation even when the costs seem high. I have tried to honor that faith, imperfectly but persistently, for 38 years. The creatures may be gone now in physical form. The Himalaya they knew continues to transform in ways that make their traditional existence impossible. But their knowledge persists in those of us who received it. Their wisdom lives on in conservation efforts they inspired, and their existence, however disputed, serves as a reminder that consciousness takes forms we barely recognize, and that responsibility to all sentient beings demands more than we typically offer. Tenzin Norbu disappeared into a blizzard in 1986 as a junior monk seeking enlightenment. He returned 9 days later with knowledge that would define his life. Testimony about beings most deny exist, documentation of environmental collapse that science would later confirm, and responsibility to speak for those who could not speak for themselves. The Yeti kept him alive in that cave for reasons that transcended simple rescue. They trusted him with their documented history of the Himalaya's destruction, hoping that witness from a monk might carry weight that other voices could not generate. They showed him juvenile bones, extinct species, and trajectories of change that have proven devastatingly accurate. Whether they survive now in any form, whether Tenzin's decades of advocacy made sufficient difference, whether humanity will ultimately demonstrate wisdom adequate to preserve what remains, these questions persist without definitive answers. But this is certain. Consciousness existed in those mountains that recognized the crisis long before humans acknowledged it. Beings maintained records across generations documenting collapse that we're only now fully experiencing, and one monk was chosen to carry that knowledge forward, to become bridge between species, to advocate for preservation when exploitation seemed easier and more profitable. Thank you for witnessing this testimony. Share it if you believe that environmental crisis demands response beyond convenient measures, that beings we don't acknowledge still deserve consideration, that wisdom sometimes comes from encounters that challenge our assumptions about what is possible. The Himalaya continues to change. The beings continue to hide or perhaps have vanished, but the truth they revealed persists. We are destroying sacred spaces at costs we barely comprehend, displacing consciousness we refuse to recognize, and the accounting for these actions will come whether we prepare for it or not. Tenzin kept faith with beings who saved him. The question now is whether we will keep faith with the planet that sustains us all.